Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining this webinar. Just one housekeeping rule before we go. In the panel on the webinar, you will see a question box. So please feel free to add any questions you may have during the webinar, and we'll make sure to have them answered at the end of the session. So I'll hand over to you, David, our Future Ready global leader and director of our Earth and Environment business in the UK.
Thank you, and good afternoon, good evening, everybody. It's great to be with you here. Looking forward to a really good and interesting hour together with you. We've split this into two main parts. First of all, myself and Tom, our global lead, based out of the US for climate change, we'll talk about what were the main outcomes from COP. I'll cover mitigation. Tom will talk about the resilience side. And then for the second part, we'll then bring that down to some national country level and talk specifically about, if that was the global agreement, what does this practically mean for those of you with businesses and operations in the US, in Canada, before then bringing it back to this side of the Atlantic into the UK. And then that gives us some time to answer the questions and to pick up anything that is of interest to you. Like I say, do feel free, if you've got questions as you go along, if you've got any questions now, just pop them in the chat function, and we've got time to cover that. So, COP26, eagerly anticipated, meant to happen last year. The theory behind COP was that this was potentially quite a quiet COP, but nevertheless a very important COP, because the purpose the main focus for this COP was for countries ahead of the conference to provide beefed up what's known as nationally determined contributions to take action within their countries to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And this is on a 5-yearly rolling cycle that was agreed in Paris as part of COP21 in 2015, and then a rolling process every 5 years, that countries are meant to come back every 5 years and beef up their targets based on accelerating science and other innovations. And so ahead of the conference, almost in some respects, we had a view about, well, where was COP going to go? The media was getting quite glass half empty on this. You can see in the slide that the red line talks about or shows the sum total of the commitments that countries have made ahead of COP on their national determined contributions. And the glass half empty is that's still miles away from the trajectory that shows what we need to be doing if we're going to hit a well below 2 degrees trajectory. On the glass half full piece, that's a mighty acceleration from just 5 years ago, and the optimists will say this was far more, or very much at the upper end of the ambition that was hoped for ahead of this year's COP. So there's grounds for optimism. Probably the bigger challenge, or one of the challenges right off the back on this, is that China, accountable for 27% of the world's emissions, did not beef up its COP, although its NDC, although it did make some good, strong commitments, particularly around overseas financing of coal-fired projects. So if we then talk specifically to the during the conference, then there's two sort of levels of agreement that we can look at on mitigation. There is the formal things that were in a document called the Glasgow Climate Pact, and we should talk about those. And then there is also some of the other, so to speak, side decisions that were also announced at the conference. And if we just talk through very briefly on what was in the Glasgow Climate Pact, it's not a long document. It's about 8 pages. It's in a lot of legalese. I have read it. I probably wouldn't necessarily advocate anybody else needing to read it in huge amounts of detail unless you're a policymaker. But the sort of things that are really key that came out of this is perhaps the most important one, I suppose, in the wider scale of things, is that countries were asked to come back next year with more beefed up NDCs, so that really did show a significant acceleration. So remember, the NDCs that countries made for this year were meant to be made, that was last year. So almost this is like an interim request that countries beef up their national development determined contributions ahead of next year's COP, which will take place in Egypt. That's glass half full, hoping that they will come up. The glass half empty is that there was some wording added into it around taking into account different national circumstances, and there's a bit of nervousness among some policymakers that China and India could use that to argue that they are already doing as much as they can on climate action. There was a lot of attention on fossil fuels, particularly coal, in the headlines. A lot of attention about a disappointment when India and China succeeded in watering down that final COP26 deal, pushing for a pledge to phase out coal and replacing phase out coal with a phase down coal. It's a disappointment, but I think, again, recognizing that this is the first time that a global climate deal has set out explicitly that fossil fuel consumption is a major driver of climate change and sets out a plan to reduce the use of coal to generate electricity. Commitment around phasing out inefficient fossil fuel subsidies, great, although most countries claim that their subsidies are always efficient. There was some work around the Paris rule book. That's a bit of a technicality, and that sort of thing mainly sets out rules about how nations fulfill their pledges that they made in Paris. And one key point is around how offsets can be used at national level on that as well. Then the other sort of three sort of broad areas which were covered in detail or were focused on in the Climate Pact was really around cash. So first of all, there was quite a bit of focus on developed countries back in 2009 promised that they would provide $100 billion in public and private funding each year from 2020 to help poor nations respond and adapt to climate change. Last year, they were about $20 billion short of that target. And before COP26, there was an assessment that showed that potentially that target of $100 billion a year wouldn't be reached until 2023. We saw that progress being beefed up, but unlikely that $100 billion will be met until next year. And there is some specific wording in the Climate Pact that developed nations need to at least double that support from 2019 levels by 2025. So that is, a significant beef up, and we'll see how countries do respond to that. And then the final point in the pact, which is just worth noting, is that developing nations also were pushing very hard for a clause around compensation to provide financial support from developed countries to developing countries, in addition to those adaptation funds, to provide financial compensation for losses that they suffer due to hurricanes, sea level rise, and other impacts worsened by climate change. That was hotly disputed by developed countries, so that there is a section in loss and damage in the final pact. It's been significantly watered down, but we absolutely expect that will be back on the table next year at COP27 in Egypt, and that will probably carry more currency because the country that is hosting the COP is also the president of the meeting, and so we will see with an African chairing the conference, we see that will get more airtime. There were also a number of other key decisions that were made during the conference that were not part of the Climate Pact, but which are also important. And so some of those that are particularly relevant, particularly from a US-Canada perspective, is the commitment on methane. to reduce methane emissions by 30% by 2030 compared with 2020 levels. That especially methane comes from agriculture and also from fossil fuels, gas transmission especially as well. The interesting thing about that is if it's implemented fully, methane has a very high global warming index, but also it doesn't hang around in the atmosphere very long. So if we can take early progress on that, we can limit global warming by about 0.2 degrees by 2050, which is a big deal. There was an announcement around trees, the Glasgow Leaders Declaration on Forests and Land Use. That covers 91% of the world's forests, commitment to halt and reverse forest loss and land degradation by 2030. Really interesting stuff on the upside. If it's implemented, it will be amazing. A glass half full perspective is Indonesia is already beginning to dispute about what does deforestation mean, and Brazil committing to ending illegal deforestation, but the downside is that much of the tree loss in Brazil is classed as legal. A lot of commitments around coal. 23 nations made new commitments to phase out coal power, so that was good. If I drop to the bottom, cars. A group of countries, companies, cities promised to phase out fossil fuel cars and vans globally by 2040, 2035 in leading markets. So for international brands, Ford, GM, Mercedes, Jaguar Land Rover, Volvo, China's BYD, they also signed up to that, as well as a number of countries, including most of the European countries as well. And Canada signed up to that as well. The downside is the US did not sign up to that one, nor did China, nor did Germany as well. I'm going to let Mel touch on the finance piece. The final one I just thought I'd mention is just the breakthrough agendas. So that was more than 40 nations coming together to say that they would align standards, coordinate investments to speed up production and bring forward the tipping point at which green technologies are more affordable. And so that's quite exciting. There's things on green electricity. There are a number of quite specific areas where the technology breakthroughs are going to be focusing on. So clean electricity, electric vehicles, green steel, hydrogen, and sustainable farming. And then the other thing, just to mention briefly as well, from a slightly outside of the COP26 tent, is ahead of COP. We also saw a global organization called Science Based Targets for the first time come up with a consistent and authoritative definition for companies of, if a company wants to make a net zero claim, then what do they have to do in order to have a robust net zero claim? That's important because we see lots of companies saying they'll be net zero by such and such a date. For the first time, we have a clear commitment, and the things that probably are new in that is two things. First of all, a requirement, absolutely you have to cover scope 1, 2, 3. Absolutely you have to cut emissions in line with a 1.5 degree trajectory. So that's near enough halving your scope 1, 2, 3 emissions by 2030. But the two new additional points, in addition to those, is that you can only use offsets for less than 10%. So it's not just to do a bit of action and then offset half of your emissions. And finally, a requirement that you should also be supporting net zero outside of the formal boundaries of scope 1, 2, and 3. So there was a lot that went on at COP26. I think overarching, just in terms of a mitigation conclusion, if your glass half empty, to continue the analogy, we should celebrate. COP26 has been good. There was a lot of progress in our view. Yes, there could have been more, but that in a political process was as good as it could have been. Will it keep climate change to 1.5 degree? I think the jury is still well out on that. There is a mighty amount of work on that. And COP26 ended with the president saying COP27 starts now, and that the UN is really going to be keen to keep the progress up, keep ratcheting up the pressure, and really make sure that over the next 12 months, those NDCs are much more significant. So that was the overview of mitigation. Let me now pass over to Tom to talk about the adaptation perspective and give his personal perspective from being in the room.
Yeah, thank you, David. And let me start by saying I am firmly in the glass half full camp. And I think that's especially appropriate if you view COP26 not just from the 1.5 degree mitigation lens, but also use a lens of adaptation and resilience, which we'll talk more about. But just to give you a little bit of a feel for what it was like to be a COP, I was privileged to be there, both representing WSP and also as a founding organizer of the International Coalition for Sustainable Infrastructure. So I had several speaking engagements. I was in dozens and dozens of sessions there for all of week one and the beginning of week two. So really did get a good feel for it. And COVID was definitely a big overhang. There's no question about it. If you were there and you were trying to get inside the actual event center, which the picture at the bottom of the slide is a panoramic view that I took out for a jog on Sunday morning, a beautiful day, and that's the complex there. So it was spread across large facilities, over 100 pavilions. And if you wanted to get inside what they called the blue zone, you had to do daily testing even if you were vaccinated. So that was an overhang. And that, of course, also meant that certain countries could not come because they were on the red list for the UK and would have had to quarantine. So the good news was all the sessions were really hybrid, and almost all of them had a mix of people in person and on screen. And it went very smoothly considering the hundreds and hundreds of sessions that occurred. Amazing how it went. So that ties into the equity, diversity, inclusion element, which was, for those who go to a lot of COPs, I've been to two, but for those who have been going for many, many years, they said this was the best COP ever from an inclusion, diversity, and equity standpoint. And that included the youth voice, not just as protester outside, which they of course were with Greta and all, but inside they were absolutely a frequent and prominent voice in the sessions. And that was great to see, as well as the global South, the most vulnerable, the most impacted by current levels of climate change. They were also very prominent, but most of them by on screen, virtually, and not in person, although some did make it in physically. Key takeaway, now firmly at the table, which wasn't always the case, and the engineering perspective, the private finance perspective, which Mel's going to talk a little bit more about, and David mentioned, adaptation and its kind of sibling, resilience, which they're very much related to each other, not exactly the same, but resilience in particular was very prominent. I'll talk a bit more about that on the next slide. And then when it came to the path forward and those in that glass half full camp in particular, a phrase that got used over and over again, including by me in my speaking engagements, was this notion of radical collaboration within organizations, across nations and regions. This is absolutely what it's going to take to be successful in climate action, again, not just for mitigation, but also for adaptation and resilience. And the other thing that was frequently talked about was the need to be agile and innovative. And that includes technology innovation, but also process innovation, just being outside the box thinkers. That's what it's going to take to get us there overall. If you can go to the next slide, please. So I mentioned that resilience was very prominent. For the first time ever, there was a resilience hub. WSP had the honor of being one of the key sponsors of the resilience hub. And one of the key things that was focused on within the resilience hub was this race to resilience, which is the sibling to the race to zero. Back in 2019, the race to zero was launched as a way to get people competing in a positive way and holding themselves accountable on the 1.5 degree ambition and mitigating greenhouse gases. The Race to Resilience was only launched this year, so the younger sibling, and really is all about recognizing that even in a 1.2 degree world, which is what we're living in today, the extreme weather effects, warming of oceans, impact of fisheries and other ways of life, agriculture, already happening, climate migration already happening, especially in the global South, people forced to leave where they live and are able to make a living. And we need to be adapting and becoming more resilient now in parallel with working on the 1.5 degree ambition. And so very happy to say that not only in the Resilience Hub was this a big focus, but across many of the other pavilions and sessions that were discussed during COP26. And there was a lot of discussion about the North and the more wealthy nations having an obligation to not only make their own regions and nations resilient and adapt to climate change, but also do their part for the global South and the developing nations. And that was a very common theme and topic, as well as, of course, just general equity and diversity being a common theme and topic as well. And both the Race to Zero and Race to Resilience are things that businesses can join. There are many ways you can join. And so I would highly recommend it. We at WSP are already part of the Race to Zero, and we'll be joining the Race to Resilience in the near future. As far as the specifics of the Resilience Hub and the focus while I was there, what that was like, it was a beehive of activity, one of the most busy hubs. There's a picture of me in the hub right before one of my speaking engagements. And again, there was a downstairs kind of a meeting and greeting place, and then upstairs was the meeting hall where we had screens for people to participate virtually, and it worked out very well. That kind of dual purpose, dual design of the pavilion itself, and very large participation from developing parts of the world, South Asia, Africa, Latin America, Caribbean, etc. There was also a lot of participation with Glasgow Caledonian University, who were major sponsors and participants as well. As far as other sponsors besides WSP, it really was leading industry representatives from banking, JP Morgan Chase, the big four, Deloitte, Google from technology, and IBM for the technology space, PwC, another big four representative, and then AXXL from the insurance. And there were several others, but these are just some of the bigger names you might recognize. And these are entities that were not part of past COPs in this way, to this degree. And so it's great to see that kind of private sector mobilization to an event like COP26 and to really making commitments themselves, but also looking to be that force multiplier as industries, which is definitely the case within the engineering industry that we belong to as well. And you can see at the bottom the different topics that were covered, a real range. And the big takeaway from that is, they cut across many of the other pavilions, and that was also very common, that you'd have topical pavilions like this, but then they would have crossover sessions with other pavilions, and there was a lot of sharing and cross-leveraging like that, which is, again, part of that needs for radical collaboration and for being that force multiplier. That's what it's going to take. And also very happy to say things like equity and justice were very prominent. Nature-based solutions, biodiversity, very prominent. And WSP, in fact, was very active in those areas as well in sessions. And that really wasn't the case anywhere near as much in past COPs. If you go to the next slide. So now I'll talk a little bit about the U.S. commitments at the country level. If you go to the next slide. David talked about the broader commitments, several of which the U.S. were part of, and the most probably impactful ones. He mentioned the methane pledge. I would say, like he said, that has a very quick return on investment to lower methane levels. So that was very important and noteworthy. I think a more specific thing that the U.S. did was agree with the EU to relieve the tariffs on aluminum and steel coming out of the EU because it is cleaner and greener than its Chinese or other counterparts from around the world. So that's a great way of showing a reward for making things in a more green way. And then, of course, being part of the public financing pledge that David also talked about, and Mel will be talking about it in a little more detail, really is a national commitment, but also very much tied into private sector from the US and from the UK and Canada and other places around the world, very prominent to bring money to the climate action fight. And again, I mentioned the technology role will be very important. Things like carbon capture, a lot of talk about carbon capture technology, which is probably 10, 15 years off from being at scale economical. But when it does become something that is viable at scale, it will be a real game changer. And so that's very, very appropriate that there was a lot of focus on that and lots of technology presentations, not just carbon capture, but hydrogen, nuclear, small scale nuclear, safe nuclear, really prominent in the discussions. And of course, all the other types of renewables, solar, wind, geothermal, and also the role that storage plays, whether it be battery storage or other technologies, when you need to pair it up with solar and wind. Very, very prominent and part of the commitments here in the US and very active in the US industry, all of these discussions in general. Lastly, the deforestation that David mentioned and commitment to nature really in a big way. Yes, the US was a part of that and very happy to see that, although as is noted there in the bracket at the bottom, there were similar commitments made previously that really haven't had the impact. So the glass half full again is that people are now more serious about it. I think there's way less skepticism out there about the need to do these things. So I am hopeful that the results this time will be much more positive and impactful. You can go to the next slide, please. So even though it wasn't at COP, during COP, the US infrastructure bill, roughly $1 trillion, huge investment in infrastructure in the US, that came to reality during COP, and there was a lot of conversation about it. So I definitely wanted to touch upon it here. And some of these overviews in the table at the right came from a webinar that we did here in the US actually last week that was led by our advisory services team. Very well attended. Happy to provide that link to people. You can see that webinar video after the fact if you weren't aware of it already. And that goes into great detail, more than I'm doing here. But just at the treetops, when you talk about climate impact, it really cuts across all of these topics that I have here at the left. And even things like safety tie into vulnerability, equity, and justice. But equity, very prominent, a lot of funding going towards more equitable infrastructure. Great to see the safety play, in particular with things like mass transit, but also where wildlife plays into safety on highway crossings and other transportation corridor crossings, causing accidents and fatalities, a big part of it. Climate in particular as a focal point, spreads across multi-modes in the infrastructure bill, airports, waterways, transportation, of course, power and energy, and the electrification of infrastructure, not just vehicles, but other parts of infrastructure and buildings themselves, a big focus. Transportation, of course, major component of this, where the biggest money is, and you can see the high dollar figures in the table at the right across all the modes of transportation. But water also getting a large amount of funding. Water and drought situations in the Western U.S. in particular being a huge need, getting much needed funding there. And then funding specific for water in disadvantaged communities being a major focus as well. And lead in drinking water being a huge issue for particularly impacting the youth. And so big funding for removing lead pipes and other lead containing components of water infrastructure across the US. And then lastly, of course, energy, a major component of the infrastructure bill with a climate implication. Electric grid and resilience, reliability being a major focus, smart grids, including microgrids and nanogrids, grants for these small scale, more local plays. Hydrogen also can be a real game changer and is likely to become at scale and economical in the next 10 to 15 years as well. So the faster we can bring that about, the better. And I mentioned carbon capture and sequestration, also reuse of carbon active care capture, major focus also will be a big game changer. And then just supply chains in general for clean energy. Part of those commitments that need to be made in scope 1, 2, and 3 that David talked about, tying in your procurement and your supply chains, focusing on that, making sure you're procuring clean energy wherever you can, and not just buying offsets to meet your net zero goals and ambitions. And then lastly, this was an article that was written by our U.S. transportation lead here in the U.S., Sophia Berger, and she talked about the 5 remarkable aspects of this bill, again, much of which ties into this climate theme, and that, that the economic impact will be absolutely huge. Bus fleet and transportation in general, the electrification of vehicles will really help us to reimagine the urban landscape and how people get around in cities. That's a huge impact of the bill. The sharp increase in discretionary funding. So there's a lot of grants here, which gives a lot of flexibility for that outside the box, innovative, agile thinking that I talked about. That's the good news. It also brings challenges because grants are oftentimes difficult to predict and how you'll be able to win against the other grant applicants. And so hopefully that will be an improved process going forward, because there are many different grant programs in the US that will be used to leverage this funding and bring positive climate action. The bill also has a real focus on reconnecting communities that have been dissected and disrupted by transportation in particular, but also could be energy corridors. And then again, lastly, the need to be innovative, and engineers. The need for engineers in general is growing exponentially because of this. And with that, I will turn it over to Mel Jager from our Canadian operation.
Thanks very much, Tom. Happy to be sharing some stuff here with you today. Just in a perfect alignment of serendipity, the entire network went down here at the office, and so I'm currently tethering my phone. I am going to keep my webcam on for as long as I possibly can, but in a worst case scenario, I may just turn it off. Generally speaking, for Canada, there were no necessarily significantly big moves, I would say, that happened at COP. A couple of new announcements, certainly a lot of commitment towards pledges. David spoke a little bit about the pact and additional subsidiary commitments and pledges around. Canada is pretty much present in almost all of them. But no additional significant commitments. Canada had already established its NDC last year, which commits to net zero by 2050, and there was no expectation that there would be anything additional to that. So I'll just highlight a few things here on what else sort of happened on the Canadian front. Prime Minister Trudeau called on global leaders to increase the share of emissions covered by carbon price, currently from about 20% to 60% by 2030. And also called for a shared minimum standard for pollution pricing to be determined exactly on where and how that goes. Aligned with what David was saying, there was a lot of talk about financing commitment to climate financing as well. Canada did take a big step there. They doubled their finance, its previous commitments, up to $5.3 billion over the next 5 years. To fund a multitude of things, specifically the transition away from coal, but also food security, adaptation, and a series of other priorities as well. One thing that spoke a little bit less about, but Canada has a hand in, is the Powering Past Coal Alliance. This was originally launched between Canada and the UK at COP23 in 2017. And has grown significantly since. A number of countries, up to about 137 now countries and subnationals and organizations, aiming to essentially accelerate the fossil fuel phase out of coal-fired power stations. It is an initiative that is financially supported by the government in Canada, and so certainly continuing to have a place. One thing that was touched on already, but an interesting one, is a pledge to phase out coal power. Canada in particular committed to banning thermal coal exports from Canada by 2030. Fewer details exactly on how that plays out, but certainly a commitment that they've made. Canada also was part of the methane emissions pledge as well, which calls for 30% reduction by 2030. Currently, there is already a target in Canada that was published last year that is committed to reducing 75% of methane emissions within the oil and gas sector already. One of the big topics, of course, as mentioned, was the emphasis on nature-based solutions and the role that they play in adapting to the impacts of climate change and the connection to biodiversity and health and wellness, etc. So Canada, again, a commitment that had already been made, but that was again reinforced and reiterated at COP, was to protect 25% of its land and its oceans by 2025, and working towards a 30% by 2030. And another interesting one, which didn't show up too much, but is interesting to see where this goes. There was an agreement between 19 countries, essentially in something called the Clydebank Declaration, of which Canada was one, to create 6 zero emissions international shipping routes by 2025, which will be interesting to see where and how that goes. Next slide, please. Canada, of course, made a multitude of financial commitments ranging in significant size. Of course, protecting nature and diversity was one of them. The one that I think has got quite a lot of international attention, of course, is ending new public financing for international unabated fossil fuels. That's incorrect. It says 2030. It's actually 2022, where Canada has committed to ending that public financing by 2022. Next slide, please. Thank you. One of the things that was quite prominent, as both David and Tom had noted, was the presence and the conversation of the financial system and financial institutions at COP that really hadn't been there before. One of the big things that came out of that was the announcement of the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero. Essentially, this is an alliance that is now made up of more than 450 institutions globally that represents 130 trillion of our financial assets, which is 40% of the global total. It is essentially an alliance of a multitude of firms that cross every edge of the financial system: banks, insurers, pension funds, asset managers, export credit agencies, stock exchanges, credit rating agencies, index providers, audit firms. It's really an extensive financial system community. Now, the alliance itself is co-chaired by the former governor of the Bank of Canada, Mark Carney, and as well Michael Bloomberg, who's currently acting as the UN Special Envoy on Climate Adaptation Solutions, as well as the Race to Zero. And it is also the vice chair of the alliance is Mary Shapiro, who is currently the head of the Secretariat for the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. So certainly prominent names, prominent institutions who are part of this. They have all committed to developing, establishing high ambition science-based targets, including net zero emissions by 2050 at the latest, as well as delivering a significant share, up to 50% of those over the next decade, and as well as making sure that they are reviewing and constantly updating those targets and reporting on them. Additionally, they've also committed to understanding and reporting on their financed emissions annually as well, which is a significant step forward. One of the other things that was announced, which was I think welcome to many in the industry, was the establishment of the International Sustainability Standards Board. So there's been a lot of pressure lately, driven mostly by the financial markets and their need for high quality information and consistent reporting in the financial markets to develop a consistent global baseline of sustainability disclosure standards. So what was announced is that the International Financial Reporting Standards Foundation, there's a lot of acronyms coming up here, is creating the ISSB to develop a global sustainability standard. The intent of this, and essentially the main driver of this, is to provide a global standard and to get away from what has currently been existing fragmented, voluntary, and a multitude of reporting standards that have in many cases brought additional cost and complexity and confusion amongst the financial players, from the companies, investors, the regulators themselves. So that's the main driver behind this. Essentially, what the idea is that the ISSB, or should I say actually the IFRS, is going to consolidate the existing Climate Disclosure Standard Board, which is a initiative of CDP, as well as the Value Reporting Foundation, which currently houses the Integrated Reporting Framework, as well as the SASB standards. Their intention is to consolidate all of that by June of 2022. In the interim, over the last 6 months, they had established a technical working group as well, of a multitude of entities to develop 2 prototype documents. Those documents were published during COP. One of them focuses on climate-related disclosures that builds on TCFD's existing recommendations, but also includes industry-specific disclosures. And the second that sets out more general sustainability disclosures. These 2 particular prototype documents are essentially going to inform the initial work of the ISSB, and the development of these sustainability disclosure standards, which we hope to see in the next couple of months, and I think is going to provide an enormous amount of alignment globally throughout the financial markets. And with that, David, I will turn it back over to you. Talk about the UK.
Great, fantastic. So yeah, just last 5 minutes or so for me, just to bring that back. And there's just a tiny bit of context before we get into some of the wider elements. Is first of all, look, the UK should celebrate the fact that the country's around about halved its greenhouse gas emissions over the past 30 years. Although a lot of that has come from the power sector, which is the blue line. And with our UK Committee on Climate Change, you can see on the right-hand side that sets a series of 5-yearly targets called carbon budgets, which then set out in order to get to net zero for 2050. These are the staging posts that the UK has to get to. So it's not no action until 2049, and then a click of the fingers, and hey presto, we go net zero. So there were 3 important things that from a UK perspective are especially worth highlighting. And maybe almost before that, the key thing I think that we've seen is, you know what, for government ambition, hosting a COP is brilliant at focusing the mind at national level. So for any of you on the call who want to advocate your governments to take fast leadership, is encourage them to host a COP. We have Egypt next year, the UAE and South Korea are pushing for COP28, maybe a Canada or a US for COP 29 or so. 3 things then, if we just flip to the next slide, please. First of all, at a corporate level, we now have some strong and new commitments for mandatory sustainable disclosure for large UK-based companies. First of all, from financial years starting from the 6th of April 2022, companies will need to be assessing and reporting their climate risks, both in terms of mitigation, so cutting emissions, and also adaptation against that international standard called TCFD. A number of firms now do that. This is the first major economy to require this, and again was a key flagship announcement by Rishi Sunak, our treasurer, before COP. And then the other piece, which was announced during COP, is that asset owners, asset managers, so fund managers as well, and if you are a listed company based in the UK, then from 2023 they will have to produce what's called a mandatory climate transition plan. That does not say you have to get to net zero. It does not say that you have to be divesting of fossil fuels. But what it does need to do is it will be produced in a consistent way and setting out what organisations are going to be doing, so that pension funds, investors, you, me as individuals, we can then make a decision on a consistent basis in terms of, you know what, does this company, are its climate ambitions sufficient for my risk appetite to invest in that as well? So those are 2 important requirements. The other thing which was important that came out of COP was ahead of this. We have had a whole slew of specific sectoral commitments, and also that was put together into an overarching net zero strategy. One of the challenges which has long been levelled at the UK government is that we have these big targets, but not really a roadmap to get there. And what's really great now we have is these are the typical things that government is saying this is what we will do and the milestones on that trajectory in order to get to a net zero UK by 2050. And so you can see here, if you are in transport, then from 2030, sales of new petrol and diesel cars and vans will be halted. From 2035, that will be the end of new hybrid car sales. From 2040, that will be the end of new diesel HGV truck sales as well. From a from a buildings perspective, then some significant commitments about the phase down of and phase out of gas boilers. So those are furnaces if you're in the US. Some very substantial commitments around the energy performance certificates, the energy efficiency that is required if you want to let or buy a building. Those are very substantial, and when those requirements were put out to consultation, that took 5% off the share price of some of the key London-based property companies. Lots of commitments around hydrogen, green hydrogen, and also some big commitments around biodiversity and also peat restoration as well, given that's a major store. There is tons more to say in that, but time precludes me to really go through that in detail. But if you want more information on specifics, we've got time trajectories on many of those. The last area that I thought it would also be worth focusing on is something which is a bit more subtle and came under the radar screen, is that ahead of COP, the UK's business department updated its carbon prices, which governments and local authorities should be considering or have to be considering when they are looking at whether to fund public sector backed capital projects. And the bit that is really eye-catching on this is that 2018 was the last update, and you can see those prices on the left-hand side. You can see that the latest update announced in September near enough quadruples the carbon price. And if you just look at the central carbon price, we now have a carbon price of round about £240 a ton. So if you're in the US, that's a carbon price of round about, let me think, $270, $280 a ton of carbon. That has a massive impact. First of all, in terms of disbenefit for business case review for high carbon emitting projects, but also it has a really transformational effect for projects which are based around energy efficiency and carbon saving projects as well. It makes many of those much more value for money, and so therefore potentially really exciting. And so yeah, that's something which actually subtle, but from a public sector perspective has a huge impact. So those were the three updates from the UK. Let me then pass over to Tom now just for the final wrap up and to go to questions.
Yeah, thank you, David. And just to hit some of the high points in conclusion, you know, 1.5 degree is still around and alive, but just barely, and we definitely need to do a lot more work globally and nationally and regionally in order to bring 1.5 degree into probability, if not you know, a definite outcome. I would say that you know, between now and next year, as David said, yeah, that countries are being asked to really think about their nationally determined contributions and really upping their ambitions. So it'll be interesting to see at COP27 in Egypt whether they actually come through on that or not. But we will keep pushing forward and making progress, I have no doubt. Second, there is a greater focus now, not in lieu of mitigation and net zero, but in addition to it, on resilience and adaptation, nature and equity, which is absolutely appropriate, and also something that WSP really is very good at providing services around each of these items. So definitely welcome for us, but these things are now at the table along with climate mitigation at this COP, and I have no doubt for all future COPs as well. And then lastly, the private sector implications and opportunities, the amount of money lining up from both the government sector and the private sector, as well as NGOs, philanthropy, is unbelievable. I've never seen an alignment of ambition and objective around a topic like I see right now around climate action. Huge opportunities. How do you blend that finance? How do you de-risk the pipeline of projects? How do you bring them fast enough to be able to leverage this money that's lining up? These are all questions that we need to answer. And again, WSP is certainly in a good position to help answer those kinds of questions. So with that, we'll open it up to questions. And if you want to put them in the chat, if there are any more, I do have a few, and I'll start with one for David. Is it foreseeable that businesses will need to consider the energy performance of employees' homes, given so many are working from home now?
It's a good question to start off with. Thank you, whoever asked that one. And of course, in WSP, we did some quite interesting analysis that showed that actually it's more carbon efficient to, at least in Europe, to work from the office rather than home if you're working on your own. More on that on our website. The answer is it depends on what your Scope 3 emissions are. For WSP, we certainly are looking at our employees' home working emissions because that is a material part of our Scope 3 emissions. If you are a manufacturer or the products that you are supplying have a very high carbon footprint, then it might be that your employees' home working carbon footprint is a very small part of your Scope 3 emissions, and so you don't need to necessarily take action on science-based targets rules. Fundamentally, you can take the rules. Alternatively, I would say, why wouldn't an organization, if you do have employees working from home, if you help them cut their footprint at home, it makes them more loyal. It's a nice touch. It makes you a purpose-led, more personal company as well.
Very good. Thank you, David. Here's one for Mel. Is the International Sustainable Standards Board just going to repeat science-based targets' great work?
Not specifically, Tom. I think the intention of the IASB is essentially to develop a global standard for what is currently a situation of fragmented different reporting standards that don't always talk to each other. And so that often has confused a lot in the industry. I think one of the calls for the multitude of people in the sector, including a lot of the working groups and the boards and the regulators, had essentially said is, let's not try to recreate the wheel here. Let's take the best of all the things that we have. And so there is a significant emphasis on things like TCFD. I'm sure it'll take a bit from SBTI to take the best parts and consolidate them into one consistent, streamlined framework. And so, to answer specifically, I think it will take the best of what it needs to get into an aligned reporting framework that makes sense for everybody and that everybody can use globally as well.
Very good, thank you. One for me here. Is the U.S. infrastructure bill compatible with a net zero future? What is the opportunity for the bill to catalyze net zero construction? I guess this is also a glass half full, glass half empty kind of situation and answer. No is a glass half empty. There aren't specifics other than the targeted dollar amounts that I mentioned that by their inherent nature will of course help with progress towards a net zero future. But if the question is about is it something that overarches and is interwoven throughout the infrastructure bill? The answer is unfortunately no. There was a lot of behind the scenes politics and having to satisfy those states that are a little less progressive, shall I say. So that definitely had an impact. I think the Build Back Better bill, which still has not been passed and is bigger, actually has more specifics with climate change and climate action woven into it in its current form, but remains to be seen what its final form might be when it gets passed, hopefully in the not too distant future. Predictions are it should pass before the end of the year, hopefully, and we'll see what that has. But I would say that how you spend this money in a sustainable net zero fashion is a major question. We've had other big funding programs in the past, like the ERA bill back in the early Obama years, that they went to shovel-ready projects with the money, things that were already on the shelf, as opposed to the most sustainable or the most impactful projects. I'm confident we'll do better this time, but it remains to be seen how much better we'll do this time and how the money is spent and what priority is put on net zero and climate mitigation and resilience in particular.
Tom, let me just jump in because it's a really interesting question. I mean, of course, you can talk about what are the projects? That's an enormous list, and some of the projects, water projects and the like, and that are tremendous in terms of building resilience and the like. But just as a really interesting area, I'm just reflecting on the work that we've done working with National Highways, which is our freeway provider here in the UK. And so working with them on their net zero strategy, they will absolutely see that that a key element of that net zero strategy is, yes, supporting the transition to electric mobility or hydrogen mobility for trucks, but actually they can really make the market for bioasphalts and really then provide also the confidence to the industry on zero carbon cements and low carbon steels as well. And actually they can really, as an anchor organization, really support the government's transition to zero carbon construction. And so that they are really going large on that as a key anchor organization. And it's a tremendous opportunity for the US potentially, given this tremendously exciting infrastructure spend that the EU has coming up.
It's a great point. It's an example of being more forward-leaning and progressive in your thinking, and actually having the funding drive ripple effects, positive ripple effects. And that reminds me, in your introduction, of course, you wear a couple hats. You are our global future ready leader for the company. And maybe building on what you just said, how does future ready play into this? How can we help use a future ready mindset to get our clients and these decision makers, policy makers, to really do exactly the kinds of things you're talking about?
I think just looking on every piece of work that we do, Tom, to be thinking about, well, what is the expected life of this project, and how will that function in a net zero future? How will that function in future climates as well? We have the answers to some of that. The other area is also really focusing on things like modular construction. We're doing that a lot now in infrastructure builds. That builds flexibility. It allows you also to build lower carbon as well. The opportunity, I think, for WSP is to help our clients spot and deliver that faster than others, and also for us to, with our global capability, to share technologies, materials and innovation ideas between our very clever teams.
Great answer, and really appreciate that perspective. And I think we're just about out of time, so I want to hand it back to Caroline to close us out here. Thank you. Thank you, Mel, and thank you, David.
Thank you.
Great.
Thanks, Tom.
Thank you so much, everyone, for joining. We hope you enjoyed the webinar. We will be sharing the presentation after the webinar, so if you do have any more questions afterwards, please feel free to send them our way. We'll do our best to answer them. And thanks again for joining. I hope you enjoyed the session. And thanks for all our presenters as well. Great.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.